Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk about this question that we return to again and again and again, which is what do we mean by this word religion? It is a remarkably difficult word to really grasp or get a handle on. We all use it. We think we know it. We think we know it when we see it. We don't always know we're doing it when we're doing it. And the new woke movements and conversations have sort of highlighted this reality, especially to new atheists and their followings who thought they kind of knew what it was, and then up it comes without any supernatural content at all. Basically, from the aughts into the 20 teens, the new atheists pretty much ran the table in terms of their definition of religion. It's an Iron Age science. Ignorant people or grifters perpetuate it when science and rationality are available to dispel it. That's the immorality of religious people like me, I suppose. And it's immoral. A good life can be had through reason and science, and Sam was there and others were there to spread the word and expose the folly of religion. Now, of course, along came Atheism Plus, and I got into this in my conversation with James Lindsay. Atheism, again, you'd often hear Sam Harris or others saying, atheism is just not believing in God. That's it. That's it. And so, okay, so atheism plus a certain moral agenda, a certain political agenda is necessary because atheists often, there was fair or unfair, often unfair, the kind of Christians would say, well, you're immoral because you have no platform upon which to build your religion. And atheists would say, we're just as moral as you people out there, but then there would be things that would happen in atheist conferences. Women would complain about some things. And so Atheism Plus comes along, and so, okay, we have atheism plus this moral this moral code, this moral agenda, this political agenda. And well, what was required was to employ this rationality to bring about a better world. And so that's what the plus was going to do. And so you had political action for justice so that racially and sexually oppressed groups could enjoy what straight white people had been enjoying. That's the plus. That's the agenda. And of course, that went the way it did and sort of split the church, not a real church, always, but the atheist community, if we can imagine it's something like that. And then, of course, the great realignment, as Peter Boghossian talks about it. And again, the shock to see an article written by Peter Boghossian in the Aquila Report. The vast majority of you have no idea what the Aquila Report is. This is a tiny little blog that mostly is paid attention to by conservative Calvinists. And boom, there it is, Peter Boghossian, right there on the Aquila Report. And churches, the old-fashioned kind with God and prayer and things like that, having very similar struggles to the atheist community. And so, well, there's some common allegiance in terms of dealing with and a whole new vocabulary. And it's really helpful to remember how recent this vocabulary has emerged. We're, talking about third wave anti-racism or critical race theory or woke religion and things like this. Now, recently there have been, in fact, I didn't. It was so recent that I didn't put the tweet in with the woke, the two guys with the shirts, the one that says woke and the one that says racist, and they both are saying the same thing. Well, that's one of the things that Benjamin Boyce, the comments that he's been making. And so the conversation continues to evolve along the lines of critical race theory, along the lines of theoretical whiteness and blackness. And it was very interesting and really was an excellent video that Brett Weinstein put together with these black intellectuals. And, I thought that was one of the best conversations on race and many of the other conversations connected to it, a lot of which I have lived much of my life dealing with in terms of black urban America. What a tremendous conversation. I benefited greatly from their conversation. But what kinds of things are whiteness and blackness? And here the Museum of African American History puts out this website about white culture, and Benjamin Boyce was right. You read that thing and it's like, Wow. And there's a lot of people in my church, if they read that thing, they'll probably never see it because they don't pay any attention to all of this. But a lot of black folks in my church that would read that thing and say, "What do you mean it's white to get to work on time or to get to church on time?" I know there's colored people time, and I'll tell you, the Nigerians who rent from us, they have their African time, which is even later than the colored people's time. But and none of that is to say that there aren't these cultural aspects of different cultural groups, but to lay it out that boldly, wow. You know, almost to the point of saying that male female monogamous relationships are part of whiteness, where many in the black community have been struggling. You know, the whole conversation about the way that slavery disrupted the nuclear family, and the conversation about whether that was actually slavery or if it was the welfare system. I mean, there's a whole huge conversation to be had there. And so then, you know, conversation about, is academic excellence or freedom or science part of whiteness? What is and isn't included in white and black culture? But it's very interesting. So Matt Taibbi, I first heard about Matt Taibbi when I was listening to the Glenn show, and John McWhorter pulled up Matt Taibbi's review of White Fragility. And I didn't know who Matt Taibbi was. You know, I'm just a Christian living under a rock in some ways. I didn't know. I don't read Rolling Stone regularly. It's just not a part of my world. And then I had read his review of White Fragility, and boom, right there he is on Brett Weinstein's show. But it's very interesting to hear the way that this had been developing. So I want to play a small clip, and I want to pay attention to the definition of religion and, let's say, a religious test. But now pay attention. I don't think Brett is really fully up to snuff, because he continues to be highly modernistic and saying, well, there's religion or science, and it's like these are not. That's a vestige of the old new atheism. Religion and science are not really comparable things at all. Science is a much smaller thing, and religion is much larger. And in many ways, that use of the word science reflects the overblown scientism, which scientism might be more analogous to religion. It's actually probably more analogous to an ideology, a crippled religion. But I want to play this clip because part of what Matt Taibbi said really caught my attention.
Then that's a significant blow, right? I mean, it speaks a lot to the problem that's that's going on across the country. And as a reporter, I'm finding out all kinds of stuff that I never knew. Like, if you're an academic now and you're applying for a job, in probably half the cases, you have to submit a statement to HR with your sort of diversity ideas, and that's a prerequisite before your application even gets to the department that might even be interested in you for whatever the subject matter is.
Now what's really interesting is when I hear that, I think about churches and Christian colleges and Christian schools where to apply to a teaching position or a pastoral position or even membership in a church, traditionally like in the Christian Reformed Church, you basically have to have your propositional beliefs about your belief system. You put them forward, and if your belief system is not in line with the university, now to have this sort of woke test for employment, yeah, that's a big deal, and it's very much sort of a religious test.
So this idea of having like these political commissars in the middle of sort of every level of intellectual work in this country, I think it's just people don't recognize the extent to which it's already happened. And from the journalistic perspective, we have a long way to go to get people to understand that.
Yeah. One thing I want to just adjust about what I heard you say earlier. You said that it was about free expression and Enlightenment ideas. And in one way, I think it is about that from the perspective of those of us defending those things, because we know
right.
how important they are. From the
Right.
point of view of the movement, I don't think it's about those things. It's almost purely about power over material things and the ability to speak openly about what's wrong with this plan, the ability to invoke something like science in order to demonstrate that a claim might be false.
Now, what claims can science verify or not verify? The first question and answer of the shorter Westminster Confession, the shorter Westminster Catechism, is, what is the chief end of man? Science can't answer that question. And if you watched any of my past videos about the manifest image and the scientific image, science can't answer that question. In fact, science can answer very little. Jordan Peterson made this clear multiple times. Science can't tell you whether or not it's good to walk through the cornfield. Now, we sort of think it can if we tie it to a telos, an end, a goal. Science might give you some instrumental knowledge, but it can't give you basically, it can't tell you if anything is good or not. It's good for something, but not good in it of itself. Science simply doesn't have that quality. Science simply is. It doesn't live. Ought lives in the world of the manifest image. Science lives in the is category.
The ability to appeal to normal rules of due process in order to establish a claim. All of these things have to be disrupted in order for a movement based on fictions, in order for it to take over.
And science hasn't established these normal rules of due process. All of this stuff, all of this normativity is part of the manifest image. As those of you who've been watching my recent videos know, I've been reading up on American religious history lately. And one of the items that comes into the Constitution is that there'll be, at least on the federal level, eventually on the state levels, no religious test applied to persons. And I'm not going to play any of this video, but I saw, some of this video of then Senator Al Franken at a Judiciary Committee hearing questioning Amy Coney Barrett. I think Dianne Feinstein did similarly. A number of the Democrats did. And essentially what they seem to be doing is applying a religious test. Now, she's Roman Catholic. And they were basically saying, well, your Roman Catholic beliefs impinge on... Oh, okay. And in a sense, we're sort of back to the Kennedy election. And what's been interesting is that, well, that's sort of where we're at. Now, one of the interviews that Glenn Lowry did on The Glenn Show on his channel was with the historian David Kaiser. Now, I know how conservative many of my audience are, and David Kaiser might upset you because he's well to the left of Glenn Lowry, but I deeply appreciate and respect Glenn Lowry and what he's doing, what he's done with his Glenn Show, because he'll talk to academics across the spectrum. Now, if you're an academic that's sort of on the right, you probably don't have too many choices if you talk to academics. But one of the points that a couple of points that David Kaiser made. One was that, in a sense, money is the real privilege in American society, much more than race. But another point that he made was that in many ways, a lot of the ideals that were put into the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution were not realized ideals. In other words, that all men are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men, well, women weren't allowed to vote. Catholics weren't allowed to vote. So in this, really, I'm very much enjoying this. It's in Audible. It's the cheapest way to get any of those great courses via Audible. But this course currently on American religious history, and I'll put a link to it in the notes, he goes into the level of, basically the level of Roman Catholic persecution that happened in the mid-19th century in America with the Irish coming in. For many Protestants, Catholicism was the antithesis of everything America stood for. And this anti-Catholicism lingered really until about the last 20, 30 years, where it's receded dramatically, partly because of eventually the abortion had always been a Catholic issue, and eventually evangelicals sort of got on board with it, and that working together in many of these culture war things has sort of united Roman Catholics and Protestants in a pretty deep way. I think part of it is also that here in the United States, many Roman Catholics were deeply impacted by Protestants, and so in many ways the American Catholic Church has been deeply impacted by Protestantism, and you can judge for yourself whether that's good or bad. But, so highbrow anti-Catholic propaganda depicted it as inimical to democratic freedom. Jonathan Pajot, in our conversation with Benjamin Boyce, admitted to his monarchical leanings. Well, he's a Canadian, so he's got a queen, so, better not immigrate to the United States, Jonathan. Samuel Morth argued that it was foreign, monarchical, and authoritarian, and well, the Roman Catholic Church has changed considerably in the last 100 or 200 years. I don't know, I'm probably offended some Roman Catholics with that statement. Others not so much because you're not happy with the changes. Fox's Book of Martyrs remained among Protestants a popular source of ideas about Catholics. It's a book of all the horrible ways that Catholics persecuted Protestants and those before the Protestant Reformation that Protestants sort of posthumously own. Advice manuals gave Protestant women instructions on how to deal with the Irish Catholic servant girl named Bridget. There's a fascinating thing in there. Lowbrow anti-Catholic propaganda told lurid tales of sexual depravity and cruelty in convents. Maria Monk's Awful Disclosure, 1836, was a bestseller. Protestants regarded clerical celibacy as unnatural. And a little bit later in the video, we're going to talk about this word natural a little bit more. But you can see already the Enlightenment ideal of natural and the way it's understood. That, you get into, Carl's ongoing promotion of natural law in the comments section here. So Protestant regarded clerical celibacy as unnatural and possibly fraudulent. Roman Catholic celibacy was a big issue in the Protestant Reformation as well. Anti-Catholic rioting in Boston and Philadelphia intensified antagonisms. The Ursuline convent in Boston was burned down by a Protestant mob in 1834. Okay? You think, there's unrest in Portland right now? Well, there is, but there was a lot of Protestant Catholic unrest in American cities. 3 days of anti-Catholic rioting in Philadelphia in 1844 caused 14 deaths. There was even a story that he told of the Catholics in one city warning the mayor of another city that if you don't get a handle on the rioting and the killing of Catholics, all of us armed Catholics are going to march to your city and really tear it up. I mean, this is the United States in the 19th century, pretty rough place. Not a lot of law and order, and firefighting was sort of a young men's sports before we had sports, and you'd have brawling in polling places. I mean, it's a pretty wild place in America in the 19th century. A schoolboy was beaten until he bled in 1859 when he refused for religious reasons to recite the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments. The Know Nothing Party aimed at excluding immigrants, especially Catholics, from the United States. And so, as David Kaiser noted, many of these values that later on, Roman Catholics, they could be citizens too. They could vote too. Women, they could vote too. Extending the franchise to African Americans, they could vote too. Universal franchise was a work in process throughout much of American history. And again, this is something that Americans, because they know so little history, even their own, don't often recognize. But I couldn't help but note at the end of this podcast, Brett pulls a very evangelical move on Matt Taibbi. I'm just kind of waiting, listening to this thing until when's Unity 2020 going to come up? When's Unity 2020 going to come up? My own take on Unity 2020, I think it's an overreach. I understand his desire. I think the idea is good, but I think it's a good bit of wishful thinking. Maybe in sort of a Bernie Sanders way. He's trying to gain momentum this time, so he'll have a shot at Unity 2024. It seems if Donald Trump wins, 2024 will be a clean slate. If Joe Biden wins, I don't think he'll run for a second term. So, maybe that's what Brett's doing. But this move Brett makes, I'll tell you, as a Protestant minister.
Brett, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I do want to ask you just straight out.
Sure.
Will you join us?
Will you embrace Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior? I mean, it's just like the football players.
Unity 2020.
Yeah.
Will you?
Oh.
You indicated that you like the plan, but frankly, the problem is many people don't know what to make of it. And for Matt Taibbi to say that he sees what it is, understands its importance, and supports it would, I think, go a long way to convincing people that this is not performance art. This is actually an attempt to right our course and preserve the Republic. And the most serious of people take it seriously.
No, I love the idea. I signed the petition on the way this morning, absolutely.
Great.
On the way this morning. Doesn't sound like a really hardcore fan. We'll see if he's Unity 2020 under his Twitter update. So we'll see if Matt Taibbi is really, really consecrated when it comes to the Unity 2020. This morning, I woke up at a bunch of notifications on my Twitter stream, and Glenn Scrivener, of course, because UK is 8 hours ahead of me, he was hunting for a half-remembered quote who said something like the following: "We're the first culture to not know why we're here. We no longer have an agreed origin story that gives us meaning and purpose in the world." He was wondering if Esther or I knew what that was, and Twitter and some of the helpful people there put forward an article, really quite good article that was out a couple of years ago, talking about the fact that, well, in secularism you're starting to lose some of this story, and it's really helpful because what it notes is that in many ways religion is a narrative, and this, if you've been watching my channel, you're aware of this. You can see Jonathan Bajot today just put out an article that he wrote for Word on Fire. He got permission to read it on his channel, and he read it, and really a terrific article where he went into some of that as well. What religion tends to do, and again, this is quite close to the sociological Durkheimian understanding of religion. Durkheim more saw it as, sort of a value of the sacred, and I think that's true, and I think that functions, but something is sacred within a narrative that the thing functions in a sacred way within the narrative. And some superhero like Captain America, part of the reason that Captain America is limited because he's Captain America. And part of what you see with Jesus in the gospel narratives is that Jesus takes this culture war where there's, so the Jewish nation had been under successive imperial rule from the time of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans, and they wanted their independence, they wanted their freedom, they wanted freedom from the contamination from Greek, and then Persian, Greek, and then Roman cultural corruption and Roman religious corruption, and so this was very much what was underway. And there would be a variety of revolts by the Jewish people against the Romans. The big one, which would result in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D. But all of that was fueled, the national identity, that which was sacred for the Jews, all of that was fueled by their historical narrative, which of course is right there in the Bible with the story out of Egypt. And part of what Jesus does is sort of universalize that narrative. And whereas everyone around Jesus wants to see, well, this is about the Jews, Jesus very much universalizes it and treats it differently. And of course, the Apostle Paul then with the ministry to the Roman Empire universalizes it even further. So I want to talk a little bit more about religion, and these are some elements of this paper that I really have to get back to because they sent me the revisions of it. Now I have to start to work on it, but I'm facing some tremendously busy weeks coming up here now, COVID, and I really have to see what I can to do to figure out how Living Stones can be more of an online church. And I know for some of you that's exciting because if we're online, you can participate in certain ways. Now, I have real issues with online church, but there might be Bible studies and other things that you can participate in. So more of that coming up. But here's a basic question. How do you know that the insides of other people around you are the same as the insides of you? Now, I'm not talking about your spleen and your intestines and your organs and your lungs. I'm talking about the experience of being inside you. A solipsist, for example, imagines that they're the only person in the world and that everyone around them is, well, it could be in Sam Harris language, it could be a movie that you're watching being played in front of your eyes, or it's this vast machine and you're the only person that counts. You're this little center of the universe. It's sort of a natural way to feel, or at least a natural way for us to feel at this point in time. Owen Barfield had this idea about the evolution of consciousness and what that meant. And one way to think about his original participation is this lack of a barrier. I noticed that Chloe Valdery has been talking about re-enchantment, and maybe I'll have a conversation with her at some point. But one way to think about this would be the quite normal assumption of ancient people that the world outside has an inside just like I have an outside and an inside. And now this is borne out in mythology, where just pretty much look at common mythologies throughout the world. The sun, moon, and stars are sort of like us. They're beings with consciousness, and they're gods, and they control the world. Now, of course, the Genesis story, and we'll get to that, is a very different story, because the sun, moon, and stars are functionaries, but we don't address them and engage them relationally like we address and engage other people. And it's actually very natural to address and engage the rest of the world, imagining that they have insides to their outsides like we have inside experience to our outsides. But the sun, the moon, and the stars, they move and decide things. And so this is, you have spirit and wind. We talked about Owen Barfield before, that there's this idea of original participation, and this division eventually evolves. And so you have a separation from participation, and they're looking for a new participation at some point. But this is all very natural, how we relate to one another in that way. And in fact, it's not only natural, it's quite common. And in fact, we sort of slip into this language even without thinking it. Just today, I saw this piece on The Atlantic about how long does COVID-19 immunity last. That's a big conversation right now. Now just pay attention to this language, and we probably don't notice it much at all, but when we think about agents, we normally process the world by identifying the agency of things that we, if asked in sort of a modernist frame, would say, no, they don't have agency. They just have this natural process. Well, what do you mean by natural process? There's this sequence of cause and effect that, if left unhindered, will result in a predictable outcome. Okay? So acquired immunity is cellular memory. Now again, pay attention. Memory is kind of an inside term of our consciousness. We all know what memory is because we have it. But cellular has, well, does the cell have consciousness? Are you a panpsychist? Acquired cellular memory. Now, of course, it's metaphorical, but pay attention that this is just the most natural way for us to talk about these things. Our language is bent this way, and of course this language is inherited on down through, which is part of Barfield's point. When our bodies fight off an infection, why do we use the word fight? We want our immune system to remember, as if our immune system has consciousness and says, oh yeah, our immune system has an inside as well as an outside. Our immune system to remember how to defeat it again. Like a person, well now we're adding a simile, like a person who, after solving a big jigsaw puzzle, recognizes and remembers how to set the pieces the next time. The whole point of vaccination is to teach the immune system, or teaching it now, as if there's a blackboard and a teacher and instruction, to teach the immune system that same puzzle solving lessons without exposing it to the full virus. And you can pluck just about any piece of science out, and we interpret it this way. We represent it often mathematically or in kinds of codes, but there's all of this implicit stuff in there, but when we appropriate it as a story. That's the most natural way for us to appropriate complicated processes like this. I continue. First, our immune system is a mysterious place. I thought we were talking about science. Now we've got mystery. And the KCL study looked at only one part of it. When a new pathogen enters the body, our adaptive immune system calls up a team of B cells, which produce antibodies and T cells. To oversimplify a bit, that's so we can take it in, because we've got to simplify the world. The B cells, antibodies, intercept and bind to invading molecules, and the killer T cells seek to destroy infected cells. Evaluating an immune response without accounting for T cells is like inventorying a national air force by leaving out the bomber jets. And in the case of COVID-19, these bomber jets could make a biggest difference. A growing collection of evidence suggests that T cells provide the strongest and longest lasting immunity to COVID-19, but this study didn't measure them at all. So they're just dealing with this scientifically, but notice, is killing COVID-19 a good thing? Science can't tell you that. If you attach, well, if you want the body to be without COVID-19, but if you would want, again, you've got the manifest image and the scientific image. The scientific image doesn't have any normativity. All normativity within the scientific image is borrowed from the manifest image. Science doesn't tell you anything. Science simply is a way of approaching the world that some being in the manifest image employs in order to seek an end that the being wants. And what is governing that being? Story. And how is that being taking in science? Story. It's all story. So, ancient world, religion. There's a meta-divine realm, and within that realm there are various functionaries. And how do we not know? Rupert Sheldrake brings up this point that the sun doesn't have an inside like I have an inside. How could you tell? I mean, this was a very big deal for a lot when having questions about death. Is this person really dead? We don't know. They might just be sleeping. They might be in a coma. They might be almost dead. Not, or even mostly dead. Princess Bride, not dead. So, no, does the world have an inside like we have an inside? Well, we're not sure. Well, our insides are super complex. That makes us really unpredictable. But how can you know? You really can't. These are just assumptions that a culture has. And in the ancient world, the assumption was they have insides like we have insides. It's not an irrational assumption to make. And so there are other beings that can account for the kind of world we have. There are gods. And the gods have stories like we have. Now, then we ask ourselves, well, did they really believe in gods? Actually, if you read ancient texts, especially people like Plato, we don't know what their insides were like. Now, we count them as human beings, and they write and they do things like we do, so it's a pretty safe assumption they have insides, but whether they thought like we did and acted like we did, Well, we know they didn't act like we did. We know they really didn't think necessarily like we did. And this comes up in this was one of Mark Vernon's. I talked to Mark quite a while ago. This is one of Mark Vernon's big points that he had. He was reading. He had just finished, I think, his dissertation or something on Plato, and been reading Barfield, and he suddenly realized, I'm reading all of Plato's words, and I think I'm thinking his thoughts after him, but his social context was radically different than mine, and even his grasp on the words, where even if you're a modern native Greek speaker, you don't read Plato's Greek. Greek has actually changed remarkably little compared to something like English. We struggle with Elizabethan English, and you get back to Chaucer's English, and we're really in trouble. Well, how did they think? This thing gets tough. To the best we know, well, there's the world out there, there's all these beings in the world, and there's these functionaries in the world, and they have insides like we have insides, and on and on and on. Now, one of the really amazing things about the European colonization of the Americas is you had Stone Age people and early modern people coming into contact with one another. And yeah, it didn't go so well, understandably so, but for those who actually took the time to live with Native Americans and get to know them and all of that, well, they learned a lot. And it was often missionaries who did that work, because if you actually wanted to convert somebody, you had to get an idea of what their values were. And so that's what they did. And so it's really a lot of missionary writings that we have any sense of Native American religion before the Europeans colonized that too in many ways. Despite numerous internal differences, most North American Indians' religion shared several characteristics with the Europeans. So there's some commonality and some difference. They believed in a powerful, benign, great spirit, kind of a high god. That's not unusual. And a powerful evil spirit or devil. I'm not going to read that word. Built sweat lodges where he prayed to the Great Spirit for protection and health. And missionaries used the language of the Great Spirit to talk about the Christian God. Cabeza de Vaca heard about the visit of evil things, and one of the things that missiologists have looked at, because I was a missionary before I was a North American pastor, is the excluded middle. That there's a whole realm of beings in the middle. This is still vivid in other places of the world. Highly secular places have maybe 2-tier at most. You have the material world and then God, and sort of this excluded middle of angels and demons. Pentecostals sort of revived it in some ways, but really quite stripped down, just down to angels and demons in most cases. They believed in lesser spirits inhabiting animals, rivers, sun, wind, trees, and fire. A Narragansett Indian explained to Roger Williams that fire must be a god because of its life-giving character. It's not an irrational, ignorant idea. It's very reasonable. Father Paul Lejeune described Indian faiths in animal spirits, dreams visiting the sleeping hunters. Every day, and actually, again, in this course in the American religious history, he told some really interesting stories about, well, there was these, like for all the beaver, there's sort of a great beaver who you can talk to. And what's really interesting, when I was reading that, I thought, boy, this sounds awful like Narnia, because in Narnia, the talking animals are a little bigger than the dumb animals. And I kind of wonder if C.S. Lewis was sneaking in some of these ideas, because the man sure read broadly and built that into it. And in order to successfully hunt the normal little beaver, you had to profitably engage the spirit of the big beaver, and you had to make offerings to that spirit, and that was very much how you engaged it. And he had some very interesting stories in this course. Alexander Henry, an English hunter who helped a group of Iroquois kill a bear, he told this story, watched the women apologizing to it and blowing tobacco smoke into its nostrils. They were, after they had killed the bear, they were basically, appeasing the bear, and they were imagining that the inside of the bear is sort of like the outside of the bear. And sometimes the the Native Americans were justified in killing an animal because the animal wasn't following the rules. And if the animal isn't following the rules, the animal deserves to be punished. And so you can see this inside-outside dynamic going on. And so you relate to the bear. And does the bear understand English? Oh, yes. Well, they weren't speaking English, but of course the bear understands. And, well, we don't believe that now, but these aren't irrational ideas. Another group of Indians explained to Father Lejeune that the spirit of the beaver visits the cabin of the man who killed it to ensure respectful treatment of its remains. And this is where the Native Americans treat the remains of the animal quite respectfully, and the Europeans did not, because they didn't have that belief system. Lewis and Clark witnessed a sex ritual designed to win favor from buffalo spirits, and the soldiers didn't mind that ritual at all. But what was America? You had sort of this time machine, and the Europeans didn't understand. Now, of course, later on, we have this series of science of anthropology where we sort of try to understand and see it through a scientific lens. But is that really the same science as what's going on in other places? The scientific method, you're trying to hold constants and variables and reduce variables. But when it comes to human beings and religious systems, it's tremendously difficult to actually reduce variables. Now, Tom Holland, one of the videos that someone pointed out to me once, which I've made tremendous use of, is, did religion exist in the ancient world? And this was one of the big points that he's made, is that you'd read the ancient text and the word religion wouldn't come up. Threskeia would come up sometime, but that was always something you did. It didn't have the same understanding that religion has today. People lived within a story, and the sacrifices, the bowing down, all of the ritual that we later look back on as religious, they didn't seem as religious at all. It's sort of the old joke that white people have no culture. Well, why don't white people have culture? White people don't have culture because they don't realize they have a culture. Now, everybody else who's not even white people, that term should go, because Appalachian people, California people. I mean, there's so many different kinds of people that to sort of whitewash them all, calling them white, is increasingly offensive. And almost all U.S. guys, what's your race? White. Well, I'm Frisian Jewish. Can I put that on the census? Will it make any sense? No, you're white. No, you just ghosted my entire ethnicity. Should I be offended by that? I don't know. Maybe I will. But the way the world works was to cut a deal with all of these powers that are out there, and that's how you make your way through a personal world. Is that the world is very personal around you, and so you offer sacrifices to Artemis for the fair winds, even if it's your wife's daughter. You offer her as a sacrifice. It didn't go well for poor King Agamemnon. You didn't have the category of religion because it was just simply how you do things. But now I won't go through all of this before because I just did it in a recent video, but Lewis makes the point that in the ancient world, morality and the numinous, so this area of the gods and the inside and the outside being the same, people responded to that and related to it via the numinous. That's basically, that was sort of the religious wavelength that it was happening. But the moral wavelength, this other sense, sort of went on a different track. And you can see that in, again, I made this point in another video, in John Walton's Ancient Near East Thought, where Israelite oracles were very different. Very quickly, the Israelites sort of bound it, and you can see that in the covenantal structure in the Bible, that in order to please God, it wasn't just important to offer sacrifices, but you had to live a certain way. And you had to conduct yourself in a certain way towards your neighbor. And this was this union that Lewis talked about, and it's a union that nobody wanted, because you had all this numinous power now wedded to morality. Well, that left people pretty exposed. Now, if you go back to this video with Tom Holland, he makes the point that, well, in the Roman world and in the Greek world, there were so many gods that Tom Holland made the point that at one point the Greeks decided to, sort of do an accounting of all the gods they needed to propitiate through sacrifices, and they realized that it was not economically feasible to manage all of that sacrifice to keep all of these gods happy. And you see some of that in the book of Acts when Paul goes to Athens and starts talking about the unknown God. They made a statue for the unknown God because in case, they miss somebody and some God shows up and says, oh, there it is. That one's to you. What, I'm with everybody else? And Paul talks about this, but then they hear about the resurrection and they scoff. Well, Tom Holland makes the point that in about the third and fourth century in the Roman Empire, things are getting a little raggedy. And people are starting to wonder, well, what if we had like one all-powerful God to sort of master all the other gods? And the Roman emperors didn't last too long. They kept overthrowing each other, and they were trying out all these different gods in this process in order to get there. Now, Constantine picks Jesus, has this vision by the Mulvian Bridge, okay, and picks Jesus, and guess what? Constantine's rule endures, and Constantine sort of inherits a church, and there are sort of then two lines of communication, because traditionally it was the emperor who was sort of the pathway to God, but now it's the church, and the church is doing all of this feeding the poor and this kind of thing, and that then sets up hundreds of years of struggle, which I'm not going to go into, but Tom Holland does, and his books like Millennium, that's the English title by accident. I thought I discovered a new Tom Holland book, but it's got a different title in the U.S. But I got a copy of the English title, which was sort of fun. And there's young Tom Holland looking, I don't know, what does he look like there? So this continues into the Middle Ages, and another book I can recommend, Heavenly Participation by Hans Boersma, goes into all of this stuff about consciousness and participation and how we relate to the world. And in many ways, all of this now we have a God like Jesus who conquered the principalities and powers, and they have a centralized institution, the church, and the relationships with the kings and the civil authorities. Well, that would continue all the way to this day. But you had all this philosophical unraveling, the kinds of stuff that Brett Sockold wrote about in transubstantiation, and you've got all this stuff going on, and you have the discovery of nature, scripture, church, and tradition, nature and the supernatural. Boersma goes through all this stuff. Cutting of the tapestry with univocity of being and Occam and nominalism, and again, more stuff than I care to go through, but Boersma goes through this. John Vervaeke went through some of this in his Meaning Crisis video because it really does remain. And then, of course, in many ways, the Protestant Reformation is trying to get back at it, but I think as Brett Sockold shows pretty effectively, the communication had been muddled, and they're not really understanding Aquinas, and so 7 sacraments gets boiled down to 2 sacraments, but those sacraments sort of become portals to God. But of course, the Protestant Reformation sort of rips up Europe and the wars that follow, and they start looking for new ways to sort of come together on truth. Now, the numinous had been the power of truth mediated through sacraments all the way down to us. Increasingly now, power is seen through nature. Does God not speak through nature? Yes, he does. Belgic Confession, God reveals himself in 2 ways, in nature and in special revelation in the Bible. That's the Belgic Confession, part of my Reformed heritage. Truth by text. You learn physics from Aristotle. Pretty quickly now, you're learning physics from nature, dropping balls, Galileo, Newton. You're doing all of this experiment. So we have truth from text to nature. We have power from the numinous to the natural. Voltaire comes along and in many ways says, hey, look, Muslims and Protestants and Catholics and Anabaptists and all these people are getting along when they're making money. Maybe the good life is built on having a secure home and having enough to eat and getting to do the kinds of things you want to do. Right there in the Enlightenment, you begin to have this idea of liberty. Well, once sort of the basics of life are secured, then you have liberty to pursue your desires. It's no longer the will of God that you pursue your own desires. And along the way, consciousness continues to evolve in a Barfieldian way. But morality, in many ways, still comes through the Bible. And this goes all the way, really, I think, until, in many respects, Nietzsche and of course, at least in the American context, full-blown into the new atheists that have already said, we get truth from nature, we get power from nature, well, maybe we can get morality from nature. And that's a little hard because nature's pretty brutal. And I think in many ways, that was where Nazism went. We get morality from nature. And when you read books about Nazi religion, that's pretty much what they meant. We're going to get our morality from nature. And, well, what is the morality? How is morality played out in nature? The strong eat the weak, as nature intended. Now, a full look at the Nazis, and people begin... Douthit made this point in an American Enterprise video that I played in one of my previous videos. We kind of pull back and say, I'm not so sure I want that kind of morality. But, World War II was quite a while ago, and, well, where are we going to go for our morality? Well, we go back to our narratives. And now values were slowly updated, and one of the weakest points that the new atheists made was that you don't find, no matter how fundamentalist in America, they're not holding slaves anymore. Why not? Because theology is sort of an epigenetic layer on top of the text that is turning things on and off as people read the text. And I know certain fundamentalists always say, "Oh, you can't pick and choose." Well, you shouldn't pick and choose. But what theology does is sort of update and turn it into a seamless process that you can live out. Now, there's diversity in that process, and in Protestantism, that's why we see all these various different churches, and they've got various different subtleties within them, but then you have the culture, and for the most part, the culture simply inherited all of this stuff. In a lot of ways, this is a lot of the work of Jonathan Peugeot, and again, his recent video was really, I thought, very well done. But now, they don't realize that they live in a story until they're forced to tell a story. Or they're taking down a statue because they're saying, we don't want Christopher Columbus as a part of our story anymore. We don't want Robert E. Lee as part of our story anymore, at least not to be celebrated. Maybe we'll put him in a museum. And so, well, in many ways, what they're doing is working on the details of the story because, hey, when the story was told, didn't go so well for the Native Americans, didn't go so well for the African Americans, didn't always go well for the women, so on and so forth. So now we're going to tell a story. Well, what story are you going to tell? And can it be a story that actually everyone participates in? And I think one of the strongest points Jonathan Peugeot continues to make is that, well, how do you have everything in the story? I was fascinated today to see this little graphic that had come out of New York State's fighting of COVID, and I thought, this is absolutely Peugeotian. Way up at the top of the hierarchy, even above the sun, you have a banner, "Love Wins," underneath, and just underneath it, a rainbow. And beneath, you have all these other different actors, the power of we. And I thought, well, here's an icon. Here's an icon of, well, New York tough. Well, this is the image of the world, and this icon tells a story, and, well, it's the story that people are trying to live out. Difficulty is that if ideologies are crippled religions, you don't just make up a religion. What you find is that when you try to put something on top and it keeps unraveling, which is exactly what we're seeing happen, well, then you have a bad one. So where do you go? You go back to a stable one. You go back to one that is time-tested. You go back to one that actually has all the various elements and a place for it, and it all coheres together. Hopefully, if you're smart, that's what you do. Otherwise, you just wind up fighting wars. Now, I watched some of this Rubin report. Now, if you watch my last video, some of my comments about Dave Rubin is sort of trying to go back into the mid 20th century narratives. And so he had this pastor on as the pastor of Justin Bieber, and I thought, well, this should be interesting. I kind of want to hear what he has to say. And again, he's just kind of going back into modernism. It's not going to work. These are principalities and polities, and they move on, and you can try to bring them back, but they don't really work. A lot of Christians are trying to, sort of nail this stuff down, and I listen to a lot of what they say, and I think it's not going to work. And I think the way forward is much more, we've talked about it for a while. The details of it are still unclear, but it'll look much more like ancient modern. And the rise of Jonathan Pageau, I think, and the rise of Jordan Peterson, I think, gives evidence to this, that it's going to be more of a neo-sacramentalism. There's going to be more of a, you have to somehow reintegrate consciousness. The pattern, you have patterns seeing patterns. Watch Jonathan Pageau's conversation with Andrea with the bangs. You have patterns seeing patterns. And we're not just going back to modernity. That day is done. Christians are going to have to do work to figure out what things look like going forward. And I can put my Christian hat on and say, well, let's trust the Holy Spirit to guide us forward. And I think it will reintegrate a lot of the ancient. I think in many ways what we're really doing is continuing to work through the issues of the Protestant Reformation and the issues that medieval Europe was working on, but now the times are different. So that's basically the product of my channel, and I don't think we're going to get there by just talking like a modernist. And it doesn't mean modernism is going away. It means that some of the good and the truthiness that we learned in modernism is going to have to stay, but it's going to have to be postmodern resistant modernity if it's going to endure. And some of the truths that we've seen from postmodernity in many ways was an attempt to reintegrate consciousness, much of the attempt a failure, but consciousness has to be reintegrated into the system. And simply going back and talking about objective this and objective that, it's not going to go. So religion, very much a work in process here. Very much a work of, well, it's what the work that I do on this channel and continue to think, and increasingly now with COVID sort of weakening the church. I was just talking to my mother and my brother-in-law about COVID, and I'm saying, if this goes on a year or two, I watched somebody on the news talking about the fact that if herd immunity isn't really, who knows what's going to happen with a vaccine. We could be in this multiple years, and it'll be the church will survive. I've got no question about that. But things will be disruptive and things will be transformed in ways that we have a difficulty anticipating. There'll be psychological outcomes. There'll be cultural outcomes. There'll be technological outcomes. And the world is already changing fast. So, as Pageau says, hang on. It's going to be a bumpy ride. But what do we mean by religion? I think the new atheist, modernist approach is dead. The woke have demonstrated there's a religious test and no supernatural needed. Well, and you can't just yell science at it. That's not going to work. You're going to have to do better at that. Science is going to have to be understandably integrated into a system, and you're going to have to figure out where you're going to get your narrative from and what you're going to value as good. And, this is where Jonathan Pageau and I are very much side by side in this, that I don't think Christianity is going anywhere. And by what I mean by that is not just lingering groups, but I actually think that this vast diversity of churches becomes a vast learning community where, imperfectly, in a very messy way, we continue to inch and learn and move forward. The Orthodox Church in America is not the Orthodox Church in Greece. It's not the Orthodox Church in Russia. It's not the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. America is going to change the Orthodox Church. It is changing the Orthodox Church just like it changed every other transplanted denomination. Now, do I believe that the Holy Spirit will use this and guide this and use the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church and the Dutch Reformed Church and many of the different churches to continue to do his work in the world? Yes. But if you read any American religious history, for example, it's a very, very messy business. And so stay tuned for more mess.